Good afternoon and welcome, Professor Wang, Professor Tam, honourable guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robert Peckham, and I am the chairperson of the Department of History. And it's a great pleasure to be here overseeing the proceedings today, particularly when our speaker is such an inspirational historian and academician. Professor Wang is Sin Wai-Kin Distinguished Visiting Professor in the Humanities at HKU. And the title of his lecture this afternoon is China's South Changing Perspectives. The event has been organized by the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences and by the Department of History and sponsored by Graduate House. And it's extraordinary to be in a lecture hall named after our distinguished speaker. We have a very tight schedule this afternoon, so I'd like to begin by calling upon our Provost and Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Tam, to introduce our speaker. Professor Tam is a pediatric surgeon, but one with truly interdisciplinary inclinations. He's in fact long championed the value of the humanities, which I can vouch for as the director of a center for the humanities of medicine. So it's entirely appropriate on many different levels, I think, that Professor Tam should be introducing the Sin Wai-Kin Distinguished Professor, Visiting Professor in the Humanities.
Thank you. You're all here to listen to Gungwu, as we call him, Professor Wang, not me. But of course, at the university level, we really need to say a few words to welcome Gungwu back. So, welcome home, Gungwu. Professor Wang is one of the world's most eminent scholars on the history of the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia and the history and civilization of China and Southeast Asia. I can testify to this with a little bit of my personal experience. When I was a reader at Oxford in early 90s, Professor Wang was invited to Oxford to give a named lecture. And although it's not in my discipline, it's always nice to have someone from Hong Kong to visit Oxford, and I made a point to attend the lecture. But to my surprise, I found that he was sitting just like today there. And because for someone in the STEM discipline, we're very used to lectures by prominent speakers who would dazzle us with PowerPoint slides of visual complexity, often with videos, interactive social media, and so forth. But Professor Wang sat there for an hour, just talking about history in a most scholarly manner, and the entire audience was captivated, me included. So I really thank you for that wonderful experience, and know how also important messages can be delivered just by speaking to the audience with your heart and with your knowledge, without necessarily the need of technology. Here, so back to introducing you. Here at Hong Kong, we know you, of course, as our 11th Vice Chancellor and one of our most distinguished honorary graduates. Born of patriotic Chinese parents in Indonesia, Professor Wang grew up in Malaysia with a short study stay in Nanjing after the Pacific War. He obtained his doctoral degree in history at the University of London in 1957 and began his long and brilliant career in Singapore, Malaysia, and Canberra, where he published his pioneering works on overseas Chinese. He was recruited by Hong Kong U in 1986 and served with distinction as its Vice Chancellor for 9 years. So again, a little secret to share with you. I probably was Professor Wang's last recruit as chair professor. And since then, I have survived another 5 vice chancellors, or we call presidents. I don't know if you made the right decision or not, but I thank you all the same. Professor Wang then went on to take up the directorship of the East Asian Institute in Singapore in 1997. Today, Professor Wang is university professor at the National University of Singapore, fellow and former president of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, foreign honorary member of the History Division of the American Academy of Arts, and academician of the Academia Sinica of Taiwan. Unlike most Chinese historians of China of his generation, Professor Wang was not born in China, nor did he live there for long periods of time. This has allowed him to observe China from a distance and as an outsider, despite his great erudition in the field and his unquestionable identification with Chinese culture. His choice of studying the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia when he returned to Malaysia in the late 1950s was, for him, simply personal. He probably did not foresee that he would become a pioneer in developing a new perspective on China in Asian and world histories. I think this is really Professor Wang in his modesty, again, a fine gentleman in saying that. But today, the idea of a soft national boundary has inspired some of the most engaging studies on modern China. Professor Wang has long argued that China needs to develop a deeper understanding of its southern neighbors when Chinese intellectuals have habitually looked towards the West for historical answers and lessons. We are only beginning to realize the wisdom of his stance and the limits of the cliché China-West dichotomy. In a recent interview, Professor Wang revealed that his coming to Hong Kong U as Vice Chancellor was largely motivated by his curiosity to observe China both at distance and closely at the same time. As an appointed member of the UGC and later as Vice Chancellor of Hong Kong U, he was directly involved in key decolonization developments of higher education in Britain's last colony in Asia. He was instrumental in transforming Hong Kong U from a colonial teaching university to a modern research-intensive university. He negotiated with the Hong Kong government on research funding strategy, promoted basic research among its faculty, and opened the university doors to graduate students from China and Asia. These policies that we have taken for granted today were unprecedented, unfamiliar, and treated with suspicion 30 years ago. But Professor Wang persisted, and by the time he stepped down in 1995, Hong Kong U had gained its competitive standing as a rising research university in Asia. The university was very, very fortunate to have him as a leader during this critical period of Hong Kong's history. He has been a world-class scholar, a visionary in education, a Chinese at heart, and a truly cosmopolitan gentleman. So we're immensely grateful for Professor Wang's unique and long leadership and his many other remarkable contributions. Today, the Hong Kong U community is proud and honored to have Professor Wang back to remind us of our unique and pivotal position on China's southern frontier. So let's join the entire gathering in welcoming Professor Wang Gungwu and look forward to your talk. Professor Wang, please.
Thank you very much for all those kind words. I must say that my wife and I are always happy to be in Hong Kong, and I'm really proud to be back here again and to speak in this hall, apart from the fact it's named after me. But But it was at the centenary year of Hong Kong U that I spoke here the last time, and I still have fond memories of that. But most of all, Margaret and I have the fondest of memories of Hong Kong U itself. And those years we spent here were some of the happiest of our lives, and we learned so much, not only about Hong Kong, but the whole region from the Hong Kong perspective. It really is something that is unforgettable. Really appreciate that. So thank all of you who are here today, but in particular my host for enabling me to be here this afternoon. I chose to speak on this subject partly in response to the fact that I came across Chinese history as something rather simple when I thought everybody knew where China was. Everybody would know that whole history of China, 5,000 years, as they used to say, was all one straightforward story. And certainly I grew up, for example, when I went to university in Nanjing, in Zhongyang Daxue, one of our compulsory subjects as a first-year student was 中国通史, and that really started from the beginning and down to the present. 3 volumes of it, I remember, and I also had to read something called 中国文化史 by Liu Yizheng. The 中国通史 was by Miao Fengling. They were the leading historians of that time in Nanjing. And we all, I think, just simply took for granted, I for one anyway, took for granted that that's it. 中国通史, beginning, middle, and end. And if you read it from cover to cover, you'll know everything. And it took me a while to realize, because I didn't expect to be a historian. I have to admit that I was very interested in literature, and I was interested in languages. And when I finished the first year, I thought I would continue to work on my literature studies at Nanjing Daxue, but it turned out was not to be. The Civil War came to Nanjing, and the university was disbanded, and I went back to Malaya to join my parents, and thereafter I had to plot a different study plan for myself, and I went to the University of Malaya. Then the first year of the University of Malaya, when it was founded in 1949, and took up a number of subjects. There were very few subjects available. History was one of them. Literature was English literature, and economics was the third one that I did. There was only four subjects. The fourth one was geography. I had to toss up between geography and economics. I did economics for 3 years. That was an old system. You do 3 years, and then you do an honors year. It was not until the end of my third year, having got my sort of BA general, that I decided to do history. And there are many reasons for that. I won't go into that. But when I started studying history, it was all about European history, Asian history, Europe in Asia, the British Empire, of course, but also other people's empires, the Dutch, Portuguese, the Spanish, who were all here at the time. It was modern history mainly, but nevertheless, the coverage of Asia was always peripheral to that of what the Europeans were bringing to Asia. It was a very exciting story. I have to say that I found the story very absorbing. I never liked history in school, but in the university I began to appreciate it. In any case, for all sorts of other reasons, I decided not to do literature or economics, but chose to do history. Now, when I started doing that and wondered what to write about, my professor, of course, encouraged me to write about what you know, where you are. Start to learn how to use primary sources in the archives. So the ideal thing is to work on the country where you're in. So we had some archives, not a great deal in Malaya. So I started on that. But I chose to study, I thought, since I do have some background in China, I would like to take up modern Chinese history, which I did. I started to work on Sun Yat-sen and Kang Youwei and their activities in the region, in Southeast Asia. Both of them had been very active. Kang Youwei and Sun Yat-sen had actually stayed some years in Singapore. and in the Straits settlements in Penang before moving on. And their careers, of course, were remarkable careers, and they really part and parcel of the great story of the modernization of China at the turn of the century. But when it came to doing my research, when I went on, I found I couldn't do modern history. Anything about modern China was suspect in Malaya. China was communist, and Malaya, Singapore, were clearly anti-communist and would have nothing to do with anything that was published on the mainland. So, and we had no access to archives. At that time, at least it was inconceivable that I would do any archival work in Taiwan, and certainly not possible on the mainland. So I was quite discouraged. The only way I could do any work on China at all was to really go back to ancient history. And so I chose to do something that would be related to my part of the world, which is the world around the oceans of Malay Archipelago, Malay Peninsula, and which was described in the early texts anyway as the Nanhai. So I wrote about the Nanhai trade. And as I wrote about it, of course, I also, at the same time that I worked earlier on Sun Yat-sen and Kang Youwei in Southeast Asia, I was very aware that there were probably something like 2 or 3 million Chinese in Southeast Asia at that time. And that the more I found out about them, they all came from 2 provinces mainly, Guangdong and Fujian. And, well, I assumed that was fine. They're Guangdong and Fujian, no less Chinese. But at least the thought began to come to my mind that they were very different from my own background. My parents came from Jiangsu, and my father's family came from Hebei. So we are sort of northerners. And I was very conscious of the fact that we didn't speak any southern dialect at home. We spoke in what we call in those days Guoyu, which is Putonghua today. And Guoyu was a national language, and there was one national language. Of course, I had learned about dialects before, but to know that the whole region was full of people all coming from 2 provinces of China made me much more conscious of a South China, which was quite different as I saw it from the China that my father and my mother told me about. And the kind of books that my father recommended, the classical texts that I was brought up with, all assumed a lot of information, all came out of northern China. The original Confucian texts, all the famous writers and poets, and even the historians of like Sima Qian and Gungwu and all people from the north. Anyway, that was the first time I began to at least question whether China was quite as simple as all that. When I finished that and I went to London to study, partly because of circumstances there, I couldn't get the supervisor I had hoped to work with. I began to work on something that I was curious about, something that I was curious about long before, but could not do in Malaya. And that is about the period of the warlords in China. And the warlords was a period of great division, but I knew I could not have access to the necessary archives at the time. So I thought, since I had worked on the Nanhai trade down to about one of the most divisive periods in Chinese history, which was the 5 dynasties at the end of the Tang Dynasty, I would study the 5 dynasties as a way of understanding what a divided China meant and how hard it was to reunite China after decades of division. So I thought that would be interesting. It's my way of sort of trying to understand what it meant to be divided, as China to be divided, and China to be reunified. I found it very absorbing. But most of all, because of my interest and curiosity about the North, because having done some work on China, on the South, because all my study on the Nanhai trade was really about South China interacting with the countries of Southeast Asia from ancient times down to about the Song Dynasty, where I stopped. But the 5 dynasties period that I studied, I decided to focus on North China to understand what North China was about, because I became very conscious of the fact that so much of what we call China was really identified with the North. And I became very self-conscious about that the North and the South was somewhat different. At least the beginnings of an understanding there was a considerable difference. But by studying the North and tracing it back, and going back to, in fact, the classical origins of China, then of course you see that China was very much the world of the great rivers, the Yellow River and the Changjiang, but mainly the Yellow River, and particularly the interaction between the plains of the Hebei, Henan, Shandong plains and the uplands of Shanxi and Shanxi, and to some extent Sichuan. But at that point, already you could see that this was as it were, the cradle of Chinese culture and civilization, and that it was regarded as the home of Chinese civilization by people thereafter. But of course, once you look at it more closely, you realize that that was not what it was, not as simple as that. So today's subject really is for me to try and see how I can share this with you. What I mean by changing perspectives here is to say there's a perspective of the South from the North, where the Chinese culture and civilization originated. And then there are perceptions of the South, by the South, of the North, and of course of itself as part of the southern part of China and other parts to China's south. Where do the differences come from? How do we differentiate between them and so on? Does it mean anything? Why does it matter? These are questions which came to my mind while I was studying at the time. But most of all, as I went on also to teach for a number of years. I was given the job of teaching Ming-Qing history, mainly from 1500 to just before the Opium War. So the second half of the Ming-Qing transition and the first half of the Qing dynasty became my primary interest of teaching. In trying to teach that for a number of years, I began to understand more about a powerful, united China under both the Ming and the Qing. So these are my starting points. So when I say that the perspective from the north of China's south, I would like to sum it up very simply as the following. To the northerners, there were three souths at least, but I just concentrate on the main three ones. One is the direct south, or mainly southeast if you like. The other is the southwest. And then there is the Nanhai, the areas beyond the sea. And there was some clear perception of that. In the south, they call them Baiyue, or Nanman, but Baiyue. And the southwest, it was certainly Xinanman. That was the general term they used. That was a northern perception of China's south for several hundred years. And then, of course, China was united by Qin Shi Huang and the Han emperors after that. So the Qin-Han unification gave a shape which included southern China. By that time, of course, parts of South China, south of the Yangtze, had already been absorbed by the state of Chu, like Wu and Yue at the mouth of the Yangtze River had already been part of that China. But then thereafter, the Qin and Han forces came down further south and took over the whole of the southern coast of China, down right to the Gulf of Tonkin, what is Gulf of Tonkin today, and in fact also reaching out to what is now northern Vietnam, or they used to call it Annan. That was the new China, a unified China in which, again, there was quite clear distinction between North and South. It took several hundred years before that was sorted out. And then yet another factor entered into the picture which I began to understand. In fact, I started to understand that by looking at the five dynasties, because most of the five dynasties were actually dynasties of non-Han Chinese. They were the Toba Turks who had come from beyond the Great Wall. And then you go back and you find that in the Qin-Han, the Qin itself and the Zhou before that, all that came from the western uplands of North China, and they had a very special relationship with the plains that were the lands of the Shang dynasty before that. So that's already there, a kind of bilateral, a combination of bilateral forces that led to the beginnings of this imperial China that conquered the rest of the continental space in the south. Already the distinction continued. Southeast China, southern Southeast China, the Baiyue eventually became more and more Chinese as more and more settlers came down from the south, from the north to the south. And of course, the southwest, they touched on it, but decided to leave them alone in the uplands. But the most important thing that I learned, of course, and it's quite obvious if you look at the history, was that of the invasions from the north again. It wasn't just the invasions of the Xiongnu earlier on. This was the invasion of what they call the Wuhu Luanhua period, which the 16 countries, the little states and kingdoms that were set up in North China, destroying basically the Han unification period, this Han unified China, and creating northern states and forcing the descendants of those people from the north, large numbers of them, to move south of the Yangtze, and then move south into Zhejiang, Fujian, Guangdong, and even the southern parts of Jiangxi and Hunan, right down to Lingnan. So that was quite clear, and we see the record of it, records of migrations, refugees, if you like, and upper-class families, large retinues of people armed so that they can defend themselves, leaving North China to come down to South China. Right? Took some centuries, but you know the story as well as I do. Then forcing the whole of South to become China under what were the southern kingdoms, the Nanchao, one after the other. While the north was basically run by these Toba Turks, who are Xianbei, actually, at that time called Xianbei. But these Toba Turks, of course, controlled North China for a long time, and eventually it was from the north that China was reunified again under the Sui and the Tang, again from the north. The perspective of the south was the north would dominate the south. At that time, quite understandable, because the north had the bigger resources, economically was still very prosperous, the south was still pretty wild and undeveloped. But over time, and particularly during the Tang Dynasty, the Sui-Tang period, the south began to develop. And particularly the economy of the Jiangzhe, the delta region of the Changjiang, developed very rich. And as the economy shifted southwards, the balance of power changed. So during the Tang Dynasty, we have a somewhat better balance of not only power, but of cultural understanding. We are constantly being reminded today that the dialects in the south probably are closer to the language of the Tang Dynasty than the language of the Putonghua of North China, because the Putonghua in North China has been contaminated by centuries of foreign invaders who have changed the nature of the Chinese language. The Putonghua that we speak today have been very much influenced by northern tribal invaders over the centuries, whereas the south, whether they're Hokkien or Cantonese or Hakka, they have brought in speech patterns which are closer to the Tang Dynasty, so that the people today, as you all know, still call themselves Tongyan and not Hanren. So already there you can see a sense of differentiation between those northerners who are not quite Chinese and the southerners who probably are also not fully Chinese, but nevertheless they are Chinese in different ways. And the understanding that they were different, I think, began to emerge in the South. And the period that I studied actually provided me with a chance to really appreciate how different they were, because the Wudai period is not only Wudai, the 5 dynasties, there were 10 kingdoms. Wudai, Shiguo, and the Shiguo, more than half of them were actually south of the Yangtze. The Nantang, Wuyue, Min, Nanhan, and all the way to Vietnam. And Chu. All of them were south of the Yangtze. And they were the 10 kingdoms. And again, it becomes very clear it was the north that won out in the end to unify the country. Remember, I told you my interest was how does a divided China become reunited again? And again, the story was quite clear. The Song dynasty came from the north. It was a product of those 5 dynasties in the north with a mixture of Chinese and Toba Turks that fought each other for a long while, and then they came south and they conquered the south. They conquered every part of the south virtually except Vietnam, which is a different story. I'll come back to that later. The message then is very clear to me. The north remained dominant right down to the 10th century. But after that, as you know, with the Song dynasty was really suffering from the fact that they never quite controlled the north. Even from the beginning, while they were marching south to conquer southern China, they could not manage to retake the 16 prefectures that were on the northern border, which in fact south of the Great Wall in the north. And that loss meant that they were crippled by that fact for the rest of the time. And for all that time, they were simply defensive, trying desperately to defend what they considered to be really China, as moving from the south, pressured by the northerners, whether the Khitans, Gyeochans, or the Xia dynasty, Xi-Xia dynasty, pressing them into finally only southern Song, which is basically south of the Yangtze. All that they just could not prevent. Now, I won't go any further, just to remind you of that, because the big change in China, what I think was absolutely transformative, was the Mongol conquest. And I say this because of 2 main reasons. One, of course, we all know they unified the whole China again. Song was defeated. All of South China, for the first time, was ruled by northerners. Not northern Chinese, but northern non-Chinese, the Mongol invaders. They were, as you all know, they were not just conquerors of China, they conquered just about everything else within reach at the time. They were so ambitious, they wanted to rule the whole world. And they didn't stop even at the land edges, they even tried conquering areas at sea. But the Mongols were a very special kind of empire, absolutely unknown in the past. It was the most successful empire up to that point. And for China, it made a tremendous difference. The Mongol invasion brought China together again under foreign rule. And although it was not more than about 90-odd years, nevertheless, what it left behind was a united China, which the Han Chinese under Zhu Yuanzhang could inherit and start again, as it were, a Han Chinese China that was one, but then be unified by the Mongols, brought together by the Mongols, because the Song could not do it themselves. They were constantly being pushed back. The Mongols saved that position and provided a unified China once more. The Ming dynasty inherited that when they chased the Mongols out, but they never were strong enough to take over the areas that the Mongols controlled outside the Great Wall. All they could do was to keep the areas of the Han Chinese provinces in North China and South China, but unified. And that was, to me, an interesting point. And of course, then the story didn't end there. The Manchus then followed after the Ming and conquered Ming from outside the wall again. Again, way out, the invading forces coming from outside the wall, taking over all of China. Again, unbelievable, a small number of people. Unlike the Mongols, by the time they conquered China, they had conquered half the world already. They were fantastic imperial powers. Manchus were not. They just a small group of people in Manchuria, and they came into, by certain fortunate circumstances, internal rebellions and so on that weakened the Ming dynasty, came through the Great Wall to take Beijing, and managed to conquer the whole of China. A small number of Manchus who had never had a big empire before was able to take over the whole of China. Again, the story complicated, I won't go into that. But simply to emphasize the fact that they too retained a unified China, but went further. Because they were not a Chinese people. They had nothing to do with China before. They knew something about the Chinese dynasty, like the Ming. They had to interact with the Ming. But they were actually what might be called a continental tribal federation of people who looked beyond China into the central part of Eurasia. And that's where they looked. They conquered the Mongols. They reached out right into Central Asia, taking over Xinjiang, dominated Tibet, and had now provided for us the present map of China. That map of China was never the same. It had never been like that, quite like that before. The map that we have was really part of the Qing Empire. And that was because the Qing was not purely a Han Chinese or a Chinese dynasty. It was a Manchu dynasty using China as a base. The economic resources of China they used. They used Chinese methods of administering the Chinese territories, but they conquered lands which the Chinese had never had anything much to do with and never succeeded in fully dominating. But they did. They dominated it and drew up boundaries of China which are totally unknown in the past. That's a brief history. But why is this period after the Mongol conquest so interesting to me? The reason is because it was during that time that this question of North and South became, on the one hand, very clear, with the North dominating, but at the same time, really integrating all of the Chinese provinces together in a way that was administratively uniform. This had been attempted before by the Qin and Han and the Tang, all had tried to do that, but the Mongols actually created what we call now the Shen system, Xing-Shen. Now we call it the provinces. That was administratively created by the Mongols. The Mings that took over, the Ming dynasty took that over. The Qing dynasty took that over, changed the boundaries a little bit, but basically the same, and tried to be as uniform as possible. The second point that I want to make was the Mongol invasion also meant taking over the southwest. As I said, the Chinese have always known about the Xinanman in the southwest, which now primarily southern parts of Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou would be more or less the southwest, bits of Guangxi as well, but that would be the southwest. But the Han Chinese had never really pushed far beyond that. And even as much with powerful Tang dynasty left them alone. So they were influenced by the Chinese, traded with the Chinese. They set up their own kingdoms, the Nanzhao and the Dali kingdoms, and they were quite independent from China. But the Mongols did something which no other conqueror from the invading dynasties from the north had ever tried to do, which was to conquer China not only directly frontally across the Yangtze, but sideways through the uplands of southwest China, down from what is now southern Gansu, down what is now eastern Sichuan, or under the Kuomintang used to call Xikang, down into Yunnan, that way. In fact, something nobody else had ever tried to do before. They did that successfully, and then in a two-pronged attack was able to unify China and destroy the Song dynasty and took over. But what they contributed to China was they added southwest China to the map of China. I had mentioned earlier on, in the north, Manchus had added the other places. What the Mongols did was to add the southwestern parts of the uplands of China to the main part of China and put them all together, integrating them for the first time in history. And thereafter, the Ming dynasty continued into Yunnan. The Qing dynasty, one after the other, got rid of all what they call the Tu Si, the local tribal chieftains, and turned them all into administrative units directly run by the center. So this process of integration from the north, Mongols, the capital was in Beijing, or even beyond. The Ming, and this is why I say it's so important, the Ming dynasty was founded by southerners, at least south of the Huai River, and they made their capital in Nanjing. They wanted to be different from these foreign invaders. But in the end, what happened? Yongle moved the capital to Beijing. Now that was the second real emperor of Ming dynasty, moved the capital to Beijing, abandoned Nanjing or kept it as a second capital, moved to Beijing and concentrated power in Beijing. In fact, the city of Beijing today is largely the city that Yunlo had mapped and built in 1420, thereabouts. And the center moved north. Again, I say, yes, the north dominated, but it was a domination whereby they also integrated the south so much into the north because of other factors, cultural factors now. What is so amazing to me was the way the northern ideas and institutions were so absorbed by all the southern educated classes, the eventual literati classes of the south, were totally absorbed by and entranced by these northern ideas and took them as the sources of all wisdom. Confucian texts, Confucian classics, in fact, all the literature which had stemmed from the north became the model of whatever they did. And insofar as the Song dynasty was in the south and helped to make this not only legitimate, but made it the central part of Chinese civilization from the north, but that it was the Zhengtong, the genuine Chinese civilization, had moved north to the south, but was not able to control the north, but the south was now the home, the real home of genuine Chinese civilization. That was how the Song, particularly in the Nansong period, with the development of Neo-Confucianism and the refinements of new ideas that were enriched Confucian thought at that time, was centered in the south. And together with the Ming dynasty, by taking on all these Neo-Confucian texts and their interpretations by Zhu Xi and others as to it becoming the standard version of all Confucianism, becoming the books that needed to be passed by all the imperial candidates and so on, within a couple of decades, it had become the core of everything to do with China. And thus the South saw itself as actually providing the leadership, the cultural, intellectual leadership of Chinese civilization. In that way, North and South was integrated, with the South self-believing that they now carried the genuine aspects of Chinese civilization, and the North having the military power and the capacity to defend China against outsiders, and therefore the military power had to be centered in the North. That was a kind of balance that seemed to have been achieved because of the Yuan dynasty, and the Ming inherited that, and curiously, the Qing accepted that. So why I say after the Mongol invasion, there was a different structure of Chinese relationships between North and South. And I see that as the South now, culturally looking north, politically without, I think, without much choice, because the military power was so much in the north, they also accepted the fact that the defense of China was a massive problem involving the Great Wall between the agricultural areas and the steppe lands of the tribal peoples, and accepted that. So that was, to me, interesting, that the integration of North and South was done in that way after the Mongol invasion. From the South, what did it look like? I have not been able to find any authentic records of what Southerners thought of the Chinese before they came south. So the original inhabitants have left no record, so we do not know. What we do know are first impressions of the Northerners who came south and settled in southern China and left their poems or their writings about what they saw. And the fact that they had opportunities now to understand a people that were not the same as the North. Remember, the North was built on two relationships between the Yellow River and the lower level, the plains of the Yellow River and the uplands of the Yellow River and the Changjiang to some extent, lesser extent. That was the basis of Chinese civilization. The South, however, if you look at the maps closely, you realize that the South was not like that at all. There were no great plains to speak of. They were a series of riverine states, or riverine centers. By riverine, I mean small rivers flowing into the South China Sea and the East China Sea, flowing there, each one providing a center for trade, for cultural development, agricultural, rural development, and each river separated from the others because of the valleys that they represented. You are fully aware of that. It starts with the Qiantangjiang in a way. The Yueguo, when they talk about Baiyue, it starts with the Qiantangjiang being not directly like the Changjiang, it was a much smaller river. And further south, many little ones. The big one is another big one is the Minjiang for Fujian. And then again, some smaller ones like the Jiulongjiang of Zhangzhou and the Hanjiang of Chaozhou. They're all the Min language, Min dialect speakers, and they all are based on riverine, small riverine valleys. Guangdong was slightly different, but still basically a riverine kingdom, like the Nanyue was based near the mouth of the Xijiang and the Dongjiang where he met. Now we talk about the Zhujiang Delta. This is a fantastically rich delta area, comparable in some ways to the Changjiang Delta, but the rivers are not so spectacular, and it did not produce the kind of civilizational achievements that were achieved in the north. But nevertheless, riverine. And all the way to Annan, even North Vietnam in Tonkin today, is the Red River, the Hong He that represents it. So if you look at them, it's a series of riverine states without the capacity to actually take over any part of North China. The North China superiority comes from the geographical distribution of water and the distribution of military power on the plains where they could control so much from the northern plains and learn to be militarily powerful. In the south, because of these little riverine systems, they remain separate for a long, long time. It was not until, as I said, after the Mongol invasion that you get the sense that all these are brought together as one single political unit dominated by the North, at least in terms of political power. But what is interesting is the further south you go, you do find on land, they're basically the same kind of riverine state. So that I'm tempted to say that southern China and the mainland parts of Southeast Asia are really part of a similar kind of social political system of riverine centers turning into port cities and eventually becoming the center of a political kingdom over time. And you see that along the coast of central Vietnam, all the little bits that flow into the South China Sea that became Champa, Zhancheng, Linyi, Zhancheng, and then the Khmer Empire, which is the much bigger valley of the Mekong flowing down to the South China Sea, the Menam, which became the basis of Ayutthaya and Siam today. And if you go further west even, for what is Burma today, riverine states with the Salween and the Irrawaddy flowing into the ocean. All of them big enough to be, from time to time, the basis of a strong kingdom, but never big enough to dominate its neighbors because they were confined to the river valleys. So the whole of South China, if you look at it that way, from Qiantangjiang, all the way down right through on the mainland to the Irrawaddy and Salween in Myanmar, there are very similar kinds of riverine states. But the interesting part was from Qin Han onwards, right down to the present, the Han Chinese basically stopped at the sea. Once they reached the sea, reaching Guangdong, even hesitated about Hainan, then failing to hold on to An Nan in Vietnam, they were content because basically they understood there was no threat from the other side, whereas all the dangers, invaders, conquerors, were coming overland from the north. So thereafter, in a way, the South, even the South, when they were Chinese, became Chinese. Tangren made no doubt, but nevertheless, when they became Chinese, also felt the same way. The dangers are from the north overland, no enemies down at sea, so you can stop at the coast and not go much further. From then onwards, they were pretty passive to start with. Trade, foreign trade coming to China was welcome, but they made no great effort to reach out to sea for a long time. Of course, we all heard about Zheng He and all that. But if you think about it, Zheng He went out 7 times and came back and decided no enemies out there. So they decided to destroy the navy and just gave it up. And the Chinese virtually forgot about it for the next 400 years. And of course, the Manchus weren't that interested. Manchus weren't that interested. But something else happened, which is, I think, very interesting. After the Mongol invasion really was very interesting. They not only were land powers, they just like to capture, take over, invade anybody within reach. And when they arrived in South China and took over the Southern Song dynasty, they found that the Song dynasty had a very good navy. It was not a navy for invading the south. It was a navy to defend Southern Song against the Khitans and the Jurchens, the Liao and Jin from the north. But they had a navy, and the southerners provided the navy. The southerners were the people who were the sailors, the shipbuilders, who understood the oceans and who really were very confident in dealing with any problems arising at sea. The northern Chinese were not famous for that. I mean, if you look at the mouth of the Yellow River, they couldn't even decide where the Yellow River would end for so long time, shifting back and forth. No naval force arose out of the Yellow River. It's quite an interesting thing. Whereas in the south, whether it's Zhejiang, Fujian, or Guangdong, shipbuilding, going out fishing into the open seas and becoming very fine sailors, learning how to deal with rough seas and typhoons and so on, the southerners knew how to do it. And the Southern Song had become sufficiently southern to appreciate that. The Mongols arrived, and the first thing they did was to take over the navy and get the Chinese to work for them and go out looking for other places to conquer. And they set out, quite extraordinary thing, they set out with a big navy to try and conquer Java. I mean, this is the first time a Chinese navy, this 150 years before Zheng He, the Mongols are the ones who set out. They set out using the Chinese navy to go and try and teach those Javanese a lesson, as they put it. It didn't lead to very much. For one thing, they didn't know what they were doing. And the other thing was they also tried it on the coast of Vietnam and Champa, again using Chinese ships, because the Mongols knew nothing about the sea. They used Chinese sailors for that. They also tried it further down. When I said they came down the southwest into Yunnan and Guizhou, they also tried to get into Vietnam and Myanmar, but they were stopped. All sorts of speculations why they were stopped, but in part because they were just basically people of the open steppe lands, horsemen and so on. They didn't know what to do with the jungles of Southeast Asia. And in the end, they didn't see the point of it, so they gave up. Anyway, but that's what stopped them. But why it is interesting is because by stopping where they did, and neither the Ming nor the Qing ever went beyond that. The borders of what is now mainland Southeast Asia and Yunnan, Guangxi, and so on, are more or less the same for the last 500 or 600 years. They haven't really changed very much. A little up and down here and there, arguing locally, people disagreeing, but basically it's the same border. And that border was more or less established by the fact that the Mongols gave up, and the Ming never really went beyond that. They had too many other problems to worry about. And the Qing dynasty, for all their power, never thought it was worth their while. So as a result, that was the border that has now become a very major border between China and what we call now the region of Southeast Asia. And that's in itself very interesting because it's now significant. And I'll come back to this before I end. On the other side, the sea was where they stopped. And as far as South China Sea was concerned, it was a sea for trade. The Chinese were open to the trade. The Song welcomed. In fact, it started again with the Wudai Shiguo, with Min, the state of Min, the kingdom of Min, the kingdom of Nanhan. They were the ones who, as separate independent kingdoms during that short period of division, they were opening up themselves to trading with the various kingdoms of Southeast Asia. And from then, developing into the Song, into a very rich trade. And the Mongols took over from that as well. They continued with that, and the trade was very open. But again, the Ming dynasty, as I mentioned to you all, once they integrated the whole thing, they became very conscious of the fact that their dangers were from the north and not from the south. So they wanted to control the amount of foreign trade that was done in southern China. So you have the famous idea of the Haijin, to stop Chinese from going abroad to trade with the foreigners, allowing foreigners to come and trade with China under very special conditions. Tributary conditions, lots of rules, bureaucratic rules and regulations, and for quite a while, the trade was really rather limited. But in the end, the very enterprising people of Guangdong and Fujian never allowed these rules to get in the way. And they continued to do a lot of private trading, which of course officially decried as piracy, illegitimate, illegal, and any of these people caught were executed and punished very badly. This was a very tough time. Ironically, it was during that period while the Southerners were beginning to be aware of an integrated, powerful North as the source of Chinese civilization, the other ordinary people in the South, the merchants, the workers, even the peasants, and the fishermen were aware that their fate does not lie in the North. Their fate is in the South. To open up trade, invite foreign trade, welcome them, go out to trade yourself, be adventurous, and go as far as you can. And so this became a new dichotomy. It was not a question of the Chinese people all agreeing. It became differentiating in its effect, because what happened was the upper classes, the Shidai Fujieji, all of them looked north because they're the source of wisdom and culture and politics and the center in Beijing. Whereas the traders, the merchant classes, those who are non-literati, were much more open-minded to the possibilities of economic development in the South. So something else is happening. While China was being integrated politically, economically, there was a gap growing between the literati dependence on the North and the way they looked to the North for almost everything. The Southerners who were really enterprising and were willing to take risks, and some of the Southerners are really great risk takers, as you know. Even today, they are really frightening how the kind of risks they're prepared to take. They have continued to do the things they believe were in their interest. And something else was happening. So from the South, there was a changing perspective about the North, which has nothing to do with the literati classes so much. It's really to do with the ordinary people who saw their future and their growth and development depending upon the sea. I could go on, but I will leave it at that because I want to come to the present. What we're looking at the present was, in the last century or so, since the beginnings of 20th century, once you destroy the imperial system and you try to create a new system of the Chinese Republic and a new system that's modeled upon the West in so many ways, and at the same time trying to retain whatever was possible to be retained from Chinese culture, all kinds of tensions and contradictions began to appear, which has troubled the Chinese people very much so for the last 120 years at least. And during that period, the Chinese people have suffered tremendous difficulties, civil wars, invasion by the Japanese, and one can go on, and I won't go into that. But simply to show that it was a period when once you take off from that sense of Chineseness that came from the emperor as the emperor of Tianxia, Yitong Tianxia kind of emperor concept, once you move away from that, and you move, another thing, you moved away also from the examination system that was totally based on the unified sense of classics, of the Confucian classics as interpreted by Zhu Xi and others. You move away from that. You, in a way, freed the people to look elsewhere. And indeed, the first decades of the 20th century were some of the most intellectually alive periods in Chinese history. It was almost as good as the Baijia Qifang kind of thing of the spring and autumn Chunqiu Zhanguo period. Almost as lively because the people are open to learn from outside, particularly from the West. The idea of being modern, the idea of being progressive, the idea that you should be as good as, if not better, than those powerful Westerners that had been bullying the Chinese for 100 years. All that became part and parcel of a new national consciousness, a sense of pride in their past, and a sense of wanting to restore that glory to the Chinese people. All that became very much I would say, the dream, and the China dream of all the leaders from Sun Yat-sen onwards down to Xi Jinping. I don't think they are all that different in that, even in the actual dream that they have, are not that different. They all stem from this fact of wanting to be modern and progressive as possible, and yet at the same time remain Chinese and able to preserve the best of Chinese values. That search for the right balance between the two is common to the intellectual classes. But again, down below, there's something else happening. As I said, again, the southern people were enterprising because they lived on the coast. They were open to the sea. They had a very different attitude towards economic opportunities than the people on land. Land transportation was always difficult throughout history, and invasion from overland has a further threat. So there are always limits on what you can do on land. But the sea was only limited by your capacity, your shipping capacity, and your technical skills that can help you overcome the dangers of going out to sea. And these southerners were pretty well equipped to handle and were quite well experienced. And they've been going out to Southeast Asia, across the South China Sea, into the Indian Ocean for a long while, ever since, I would say, the Song dynasty, or even go back to the Nanhan, the Song dynasty, and certainly even through the Haijin period of the Ming dynasty, the Fujian and Guangdong people were reaching out in the south by sea. With that background, what we now see in the 20th century was a new tension, the tension of the end of the Second World War, end of imperialism, decolonization, a new period of nation building in Southeast Asia, in which the South China Sea now was occupied by different countries, independent countries, which had sovereign rights of their own, and China was only one of them in dealing with the southern neighborhood. And the South itself was tensely poised between those who favored opening up the coast and those who favored looking to Soviet Union and bringing all the major factories into the interior that which Mao Zedong did, you all recall. That tension between what was drawn inward into the continental part of China and the coast, which all saw the advantages of being open, but were nevertheless closed, except Hong Kong, of course. This is where Hong Kong not only benefited, but Hong Kong offered a great deal to China to help at least provide some outlet for that period when the rest of the coast was closed down. Moving from that was one of the most historic decisions ever made, and you all know who I mean. Deng Xiaoping's decision to open up, 改革开放, to open up to the outside world, was based on basically a very simple idea, that the modern economy, ever since about at least the 18th century, the modern economy was a maritime economy, primarily a maritime economy. Most of the economic developments under capitalism were very successful because of the openness of the sea. And it was the fact that you could sail easily after the Columbus crossing the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Ocean. Those three oceans are completely opened up. And so that all those people involved in that Atlantic development of modern economic growth and industrial and technological inventions could take advantage of these open oceans to reach out in every direction. What we mean by the global is maritime, quite frankly, at least the modern global. Mongols tried to kind of land global, but that didn't last very long. But this one has tremendous potential. And I don't know whether Deng Xiaoping came to this conclusion just like that, or whether he carefully calculated the errors of his predecessor, Mao Zedong, to have gone continental to the extent that he did and closing down the coast. But whatever the source of his inspiration, that decision was transformative again. By changing over, opening up to the sea, and accepting the fact that the modern free market economy was primarily a maritime economy, it has enabled China to develop so rapidly in the last 40 years. There is no question in my mind that is the secret of the 改革开放 policies to be open. And this then is something totally new in Chinese history, and something that the people in the South, China's South, had always understood, but never had the power or the kind of leadership that could provide the inspiration to truly open up. And open up not like Song in a kind of dependent, defensive sort of way, but open it up as an entrepreneurial, outreach, outgoing way, reaching as far as possible for all the resources, the markets that were available out there, so to speak. And to have that ambition was totally unknown in the politics and the political power systems in China ever in the past. It was under Deng Xiaoping that this began. Of course, today we may argue there were probably problems he never foresaw, and the kind of corruption, the kind of dissonance, moral lack of compass that you sense about China today. Some of them may be the consequences of this opening up in a state of confusion after 30 or 40 years of closing in too tightly. Yes, there may be faults in that too, but nevertheless, the transformative direction that Deng Xiaoping pointed to has made all the difference. And this is so new to the Chinese that for the first time, the Chinese actually need naval power. They need, because their maritime interests now need protection, something that they never had to think about before. In the whole history of China that I can think of, never thought about before. The South now has become absolutely central to the economic development of China. That the political power may still be in Beijing, but the economic dynamism, the kind of openness that the South had always been, in fact, asking for, that they never got from their political leaders in the North, now they have, at least under Deng Xiaoping it did. What I think now we face is a very interesting challenge, and I'll end with this. I won't call it a conclusion. I don't have a conclusion. I will simply suggest that these are now the immediate challenges that the Chinese have. They've now got this economic development on the right track. They know how to do it, how to go forward. But at the same time, they know that China is not all coastal. The bulk of China, the vast majority of the people of China are quite far away from the coast. And in the fact that the Chinese borders that were extended by the Manchus into Central Asia means they have a vast, enormous land border. More than 2/3 of China's borders are on land, only 1/3 at sea. And however successful the opening to the sea has enabled China's economy to develop, they must nevertheless not forget that their traditional enemies have come from overland. Their soft borders overland, very long and very difficult to defend. In fact, the Chinese never really found a solution to defend them. All the efforts to defend them with the Great Wall was actually futile. And the Great Wall was simply just a limiting thing, but never could really defend the interests of the 18 provinces within the wall. How are they to defend their long boundaries, borders, which are bordering, I think, if I'm not mistaken, something like 14 different countries, some of which are not necessarily friendly to China. Now, that's a fact. To find so much success in the middle of considerable uncertainty about your 2/3 land borders, at the moment looking controllable, but nevertheless challenging, and at the same time open to the sea in a way Chinese have never been open to the sea before, and facing the fact that the naval powers of the world are not particularly friendly to China. And in fact, it was naval power that first opened up China by force with the first Opium War in 1840s, when Hong Kong changed hands for a while. And that remains in the background. So what is China to do? China's south is open more than ever before, and yet the tradition of wanting it to be controlled to some extent remains very, very strong, certainly by those with political power in Beijing, who are much more aware that there are other threats and challenges to China's safety and defenses, which are really overland. And that will not go away. That will always remain, and as I understand it, will always remain a vulnerable zone for the Chinese to bear in mind. To have that facing the Chinese Communist Party leaders today is something that they cannot run away from. They cannot put all their money, as it were, and all their ideas and strength into keeping the coast open. They have to take the land into account as well. I mention this because it is actually helps to explain what the Chinese, one of the biggest and most visionary ideas that have come out of China in the last few years, and that is this one belt, one road idea, which Hong Kong people are very sensitive to and quite rightly can see many opportunities to build on that idea. But one of the key things about one belt, one road is that there is the land part as well as the sea part. And in that visionary picture in Xi Jinping's mind and Chinese Communist Party's leaders today is the understanding there is a overland continental is part of this vision, and the sea part, the road part is why one is belt and one is road, don't ask me. But anyway, the fact is that there are two forces in that vision. And I don't think that's an accident. I think this is a product of this evolving picture of China integrating and having dividing forces, facing in both directions, having challenges, and they seem to, as it were, alternate. Once in a while is more land problems. Another time now, particularly since the 19th century, the challenges at sea are really great. And in particular, because the Chinese economy now is dependent on that open sea, an openness which they never had to take that seriously in the past before. And not only that, the openness to an area which they never paid much attention to before. This area that is now called Southeast Asia, and no longer colonial territories, but nation states built on colonial states, all built on the idea of nation states, each state having sovereignty of its citizens and willing to defend their national borders like any other state. And very proud of their new nations, but in the course of building that, tremendous tensions within those states. And they have come together as small states to try and protect their interests against big powers like United States, China, India, or whoever, or Japan. And they are trying to find their way. And China has to understand that. You're all familiar with the fact that during the Cold War, Southeast Asia was divided into two. But at the end of the Cold War, for the first time in the history of the region, that all these territories, now 10 states, have actually come together. And the year 1999 is particularly significant because it was in 1999 that all 10 of them became ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And this is something very new, but very significant because it is the other part of South China Sea. The northern part is China, including Taiwan, and down in the south, the 3/4 of it would be the ASEAN 10, or 8, at least 8 members of the ASEAN states have borders on the South China Sea. And this is China's major economic throughway to the resources and markets of the world. The other being the Pacific, but the Pacific, of course, is very much dominated by United States and Japan, and that's pretty obvious to the Chinese. But the other side, the southern part, China's south, is much more open and much more, at least usable to be a permanent, safe route to all the economic resources, markets that they need. And I think the Chinese have understood that finally. Something that they never paid much attention to. In fact, not at all. And it was only really in the last few decades that the Chinese government has begun to take Southeast Asia seriously. And when they've done so, there are a number of things that come to mind. First of all, this is very much a world of the traders, the businessmen, the merchants, the class of entrepreneurs that Chinese traditional history has never really appreciated. But these are now the people who are responsible for keeping these lanes open and keeping the Chinese economy ticking away. That's number one, a big change in Chinese history. Number two, that region had never been united before. Mind you, I'm not suggesting that ASEAN is united. It's still far from it. They're still struggling to find their way to become more and more united, to be able to stay united on all major issues. They're not quite there yet. But for them to even to come together the way they have for the last 20-odd years, since the 1990s at the end of the Cold War, to have come this far is quite remarkable. And it is in their interest to be so, to continue to be so. Then thirdly, the fact that the sea has become so important has become a source of tension between the United States and China. Not only the United States and its partners and allies like Japan, Australia, and of course the Americans are also trying to win over the Indians to join in to take particular care over what China does at sea. Something that, again, throughout Chinese history has never been a problem. Now there is a problem. And this one, of course, I do not know how it will end. It has many possibilities, and some of it, of course, less desirable than others. But the fact is that this is the product of a new China's South, a South in which the Chinese people in the South have now a much bigger role to play in the future of China than they've had for a long, long time. And for Southeast Asia, a major change to be able to act as much as possible together. In fact, there's a very important meeting in Singapore today, the ASEAN conference, in which leaders from all over the world are going to Singapore to meet about ASEAN, including China. China's represented there too. This is a major change. Nothing like that ever happened in the past. It is so new that I'm not sure that anybody knows what to do with it. Even the countries within ASEAN do not know how to go about it. But they're all feeling their way. And these regular meetings that they have is one of the ways of trying to get around the major issues that they face. But again, I repeat, China's South has become much more complicated, but also at the same time much more important than ever in Chinese history. That the southern people who know the coast and know the sea, the southern people who now are keeping watch or keeping guard on the land borders between ASEAN and also between Tibet and India, all those people are also that become integrated into China in a way never before. And that again has an added dimension, so that the mainland states of Southeast Asia that border on China have now become part of a different system, part of an ASEAN group, no longer subject to the kind of border relations of the past, but now a major regional border between a new region and China. Again, the South has a new role. And the final point I want to make is that ASEAN itself has become classified as a strategic zone for just about all the powers. The reason being very simple. The fact that the two oceans have become so important strategically for all the powers concerned. The Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, because of the economic dynamism that has shifted from the Atlantic to this part of the world, these two oceans now outweigh the importance of the North Atlantic that have been dominant for many, at least 2 or 3 centuries. Now the shift is becoming clearer. Shifting, Pacific of course had begun, but Indian Ocean is now equally important. And it does look as if the future economic dynamism of this region will completely overwhelm that of the North Atlantic. For growth, development, for future development, this is where the action is going to be. And if that is the case, and it is in a way reflected in the American policy decision, major policy decision to change their phraseology, the nomenclature of the Asia-Pacific into the Indo-Pacific. The two oceans have always been there. The Indo-Pacific, in fact, has always been the activities where the Asians have been trading for centuries, and I can go on about that. But today, this is an American strategic decision to put the Indo-Pacific as the strategic zone of their ultimate interest. And if that is taken seriously, economic shift from the Atlantic to these two oceans, the fact that it's now strategically declared to be the ocean of interest, means that Southeast Asia, which actually faces both oceans, is the only part that faces both oceans, becomes strategically even more significant than ever. And this, although it's not part of China, it is certainly part of China's south. Thank you very much. So the Q&A.
Great. I wanted to thank you for a wonderful, wonderful talk. And it has to be a model history telling of about 50 minutes of pure eloquence with no ums and ahs. And the beautiful way in which you wove your own life world into this story. And I think at a time when history is often on the defensive, having to explain why it exists, you offer a very powerful, I think, argument why history can help us grapple with the confusions of the present. And I also think the way in which you have come to history and the questions you have come through your own life story. And I'm actually, at the moment, reading your autobiography. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. We have a very short time for questions because I've been instructed that we have to leave by 6:30, which gives us, I think, 5 minutes. But if we can open, I'm sure many people will have questions, if we can open up the discussion. And please, if you have a question, make it very succinct. Everybody, great. Do you just...
Professor Wang, thank you for gracing Hong Kong University again. I'm always under the impression that the best historians become visionaries, of which you're obviously one. Can you talk to us about the importance and the influence and the impact of technology, modern technology, on the thesis you've just presented? Perspective from the north towards the south, and the perspective of the south towards the north. Thank you.
I do not know enough about the technology of the future. I'm only...
I noticed Singapore has much changed because of internet, mobile phones.
Well, I have to take that to be a given, that it has technology. It is technology that has transformed the world in the last 200 years. The Industrial Revolution, the science and scientific revolution, the Industrial Revolution, that has actually made all the difference. Before that, there were just very clear limits as to what we could do. But once that was open, and that was used by the people in Western Europe to build powerful navies that could gird the earth, go round easily, and actually take control of all the waters, has completely transformed the nature of global economy. I mean, today, everything you talk about, the free market economy, at least to me now, it seems to be totally dependent on the sea. I mean, I know you can add a little bit to the air, but land transport is very limited. and will continue to be limited. Even when you talk about the One Belt, One Road, you can see straight away how much easier it will be by sea if they can manage that part well, and how difficult and expensive it is to move into the belt part. Overland communications will always be difficult. There will always be land borders between one country and the other, whereas the open sea has a tremendous still, after 200 or 300 years of naval transformations and maritime technologies being so great now, this will continue. Whether other future technologies now, whether you don't need land or sea, it's all cyberspace and so on, well, that is open to just about everybody. In fact, I'm told that when it comes to cyberspace, the fact that of course it depends on very rich and powerful countries to make some of those fine technological inventions that drive the world today. But if any country can do that, can do a lot. I mean, think of a little country like Finland for a little while. You know, it could be number one for quite a while. Theoretically, it's now much more even. It doesn't depend on just great big powers dominating the world. It depends on the combination of skills, brain power, knowledge concentrations, and the wisdom to make use of them to the best effect may give you many more advantages than before, not just size of population and land.
Professor Wang, I have 3 questions. First is that should the phrase from ancient times, 自古以来, be taken out of the history textbook for children? Because it seems that from your talk, there is no such thing as 自古以来, particularly followed by place ABC is part of China. And the second question is, what's your take on Xi Jinping's concept of China Dream? Xi, for himself, is definitely entitled to have a dream for China, but what's his China dream says for everybody? Can he actually raise a China dream for so many different Chinese people? And the third question is, you said that people in southern China...
That's getting very difficult now. I'm not even sure I got your first question.
The first question is that should the phrase of 自古以来 from ancient times be taken out of history textbook for students? Second question is, what's your take for China Dream?
To be fair to
自古以来,
everyone,
whether the phrase is meaningful anymore, you mean?
Yeah, 自古以来, say Hong Kong is part of China.
To put a question mark there.
Okay, so the second question is, what's your take on Xi Jinping's China Dream?
Do you think, to be fair to everybody, you could ask one question? Because if everyone asked 3 questions, we'd only have...
Let me just, that one, on Xi Jinping's China Dream. I don't know what it is, but all I can think of is that it is not very different from what he has said. It's not very different from what I understood from all those people like Sun Yat-sen and the others, before all the way down to, in fact, go back to Kang Yu-wei and to even the last conservative Confucian mandarins who, at the end of the Qing dynasty, and what they were thinking about. Because essentially, it's what I summed it up in one phrase. Joining a deep-rooted past to a new world order. They want the new world order. They don't want to change it. They actually thrive in it today, but they want to be able to join that past so that it is linked together in some meaningful way that they can identify as Chinese. I believe that almost all intellectuals that I have ever spoken to or read about, and from their writings, they all share this hope. Mind you, it's not difficult, it's not easy. I mean, you can see for 100-odd years now, people have been arguing, the Chinese, and some of the best brains in China have been arguing how to achieve this balance. And they haven't really agreed on where it is. And whether Xi Jinping can impose his dream on everybody else or not, I do not know. But I feel that whatever it is, it doesn't depart very much from the general idea that to learn everything from the modern world as you can. I would say something like, today, I would say Chinese leaders would say, we have learned almost everything that the West has to teach us. 80 to 90% of what we do is basically what we learn from the West. But there is a 15%, 10%, which is we like to preserve, that we can be proud of and still identify as Chinese. And what that 15 or 20% should be or that cannot be agreed to yet, I think, and people argue about what to preserve. Because obviously, to preserve everything that what Confucius says would not be very helpful for this progressive world that the Chinese want to identify with the New World Order. There's not that much in Confucius that is relevant to that part. Individually, in the society itself, among people, in their families, individual relationships, other social relationships, yes, there's still a lot that could be very valuable. But how to preserve it? After all the damage that has been done over the last few decades, it's now, I would say, almost utter confusion as to what is left of it that can be preserved and how people can once again agree to what part of the Chinese tradition should be preserved. That part I cannot see, to be honest. Sorry about that.
Hello, Professor Wang. My question is about, you have mentioned that China should enhance its relationship with Southeast Asian countries, especially in economic cooperation. But since China has lots of border conflicts with Southeastern Asian countries, and how Chinese and Southeastern countries can build mutual understanding and the cooperation of economy under the circumstances that China seems more aggressive than ever before on the border conflicts. Thank you.
There are a lot of assumptions behind your statement, which I'm not sure I'm with you there. But let's put it this way. The time may be past for China to deal with individual countries in Southeast Asia, because these smaller countries in Southeast Asia know that it is in their interest to stick together if they want to survive in the middle of all these big guys in the neighborhood, all asserting their rights. And if they were disunited, the old phrase in English is they don't want, unless you hang together, you hang separately. And I don't think they want to do that. So the question of old days where China talked about bilateral relations with each of those countries seem to be more and more difficult now. Although the Chinese are still doing that, at the same time, if you see what the Chinese also say, they respect ASEAN. They would like ASEAN to be united so that they can talk together and come to some agreement. But the choice between bilateral relations in which China is so big and each one is so small, and the fact that a region of 10, each asserting their sovereign rights, can actually form a body that can make a difference, can actually talk back, as it were, to the Chinese, is something that I think the Chinese have come round to. I mean, 20 years ago, the Chinese were very suspicious of any of these countries, but most of them being formerly anti-communist countries and probably not very favorable to the Chinese. But today, if you listen to watch the Chinese writings on it, and if you go to meet some of the experts on Southeast Asia in China today, they always take very respectful towards the idea of ASEAN and wish it could be a little bit more effective or a bit better united or could understand what each other's interests are in such a way that they could help their own future together. These are still, I would say, work in progress.
I think two more questions. So there's one question there and there. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Wang. I'm very interested in locally in Hong Kong. In the recent 30 years or so, in our secondary school, they don't have to learn any Chinese history. All is voluntary, and compared to my days, I had my secondary school days in the 70s. Chinese history is compulsory, whether you like it or not. And I actually admire scholars like you who know so much. How can we make our youngsters know more, and in an interesting way?
I honestly don't know. I mean, as I said, when I was young, I was not interested in history. But I was interested in people. I was interested in places. I was interested in my environment, curious about who was who and what was what. And eventually got to the point when I realized that everything has history. Nothing is without history. So once you start with that premise, then everything that interests you has a background to it. What is its origins? How did it become what it was? You know, why is such a place a colony? And why is it now a nation state? Once you start asking, then I cannot think of any topic that does not have a history. And I'm constantly fascinated by the fact that the Chinese understanding of history and modern historiography as practiced by professional historians is such a big gap, because the original understanding of history is very much to do with governments, with the rule of how governments behave, with what is the mirror for government, you know, what Zhi Tongjian is about. History is to help governments rule better. That is their hope. But today, professional historians have now demonstrated, with the help of other disciplines in the social sciences, in the sciences, natural sciences as well, that everything is related. Everything can help us understand. You cannot study politics of a country without understanding its economics, its society, its cultural values, and all the little things that happen over time that made the country what it is today. If you try to skip some of it, you probably would find yourself in difficulties understanding what is happening today. So I do not know that there's no shortcut, I have to say. I'm not very good at reading textbooks or recommending textbooks, but I read all sorts of miscellaneous things which happen to interest me, add to my curiosity, and one thing leads to another, and eventually they all seem to converge upon the idea that if you don't know the past, it's very difficult to know what to do with your own life or to find out what you are yourself.
That is a very powerful promotion why we should study history. And you could, we've got a very, very successful history department, so if you wanted to study history, yes, and then.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wang, for giving us a very concise and valuable insights in such on Chinese history in both temporal and spatial scale, which as you have spent 9 years in Hong Kong, so I'm just want to introduce a Hong Kong angle under this China-South changing perspective. How would you, given you have long years of stay in Hong Kong, to put Hong Kong's role in such a changing perspective in what you have described? Whether do you believe Hong Kong will have a unique place or some sort of unique role that you will help China to fulfill or to play in this perspective that you have just described?
Difficult one. Really put me on the spot. I mean, let me go back a little bit. I've always been very fascinated by the idea that that territory area called China, it's open to the south, to the sea, has so from very, very early on been through the city of Guangzhou. Guangzhou is the only city in China I know that has been continuously a port for going out to sea, all that time. Hong Kong, to me, represents the additional element put in by modern progress, led by the British in the 19th century, British Navy in particular, and needing Hong Kong for their purposes. But as a result, they place in the hands of the people of Hong Kong a completely new set of conditions and terms and capacities which Guangzhou did not have. And to this day, I still see the balance, very interesting balance between the two. And the way, for example, I'm fascinated, Shenzhen developed in the last few decades is utterly amazing. And it could not have happened if there had not been a Hong Kong. Guangzhou alone could not have produced Shenzhen. And yet at the same time, I have to recognize that, and I did come out in print on the subject, that the big question mark is also about what we understand by one country, two systems. Because as I saw it, and looking back in the 1840s and down, and all the way Hong Kong developed, I have suggested that actually Hong Kong had one country, two systems from day one. It is not new. It's not, I mean, I knew the idea, the phrase itself is new, brought up by Deng Xiaoping and so on. But from the beginning, in practice, that was what was happening. It was, one country was always China, because I never for a moment did I feel that the people of Hong Kong were separate from China. They were exercising certain rights and took advantage of certain technological and other economic advantages by having the British here, so that the two systems, one protected in one way and the other by cultural values and social linkages, family and other linkages with the neighboring provinces in China, that was there from the beginning, and it has served each other very well. They've actually made use of each other very well to develop Hong Kong the way it has. So the legalistic aspects of one party, one country, two systems doesn't help me understand what is to come. But the fundamental one country, two systems in the minds and the hearts of the people involved, both in China as well as in Hong Kong, that has tremendous potential. At least this is how I feel.
So, one last question. Yes.
Thank you very much. Extraordinary talk. Thank you so much. Just one question about India, because you spoke of two oceans, Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean. You are right, Navy, Changhua. But what is the possibility to have India, which is always on Belt and Road, but never ever, for the moment, and China on Belt and Road? I have some hope with Shah Bahar in Iran to have a collaboration, but it seems it's impossible. No collaboration in Shah Bahar, it seems. So India, Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, very important, Southeast Asia, as you said.
There are, to my mind, a lot of unknowns about India, not only because it has a very long history that is not very well recorded and very difficult to understand because it is expressed in so many different ways and not just simply in the form of annals and chronicles and so on, but expressed in different ways, cultural, religious ways, which are very profound. So difficult to understand. But what is really new was that there has never been one India before. In fact, quite frankly, the Indians wished they had taken all of British India and didn't let those Pakistanis get away with it, or Bangladeshis. They wanted to inherit all of British India. And that would have been very new in history. Never before has there been one India. Even today, even what remains without Pakistan and Bangladesh, is still an India that had never existed in the past as one country, with the weight of people, talent, skills, and tremendous cultural richness that could influence the world in the future. I think the potential is tremendous. But at the same time, because it is so new, the Indian people do not yet know how to handle this oneness of India. And that's very different from China. China, for all the north-south thing that I've been talking about, had a fundamentally agreed set of principles, which they would quarrel about bits and pieces. But there was something that had kept them more or less with one united vision of the Tianxia that they understood, which kept the Chinese going, division, coming together, reunifying, back and forth. The Indians never experienced that. So today, when either the United States or Russia have expectations of India and so on, they are also very frustrated. And the Indians themselves are frustrated because they do not know yet how to treat themselves and talk of themselves and act as one country. in the way that the Chinese have much less difficulty.
Great, thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to bring it to a conclusion. Please join me in thanking Gungwu.
Thank you.